Good evening, everyone. We might as well get moving here. I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Industrial Community Development Committee. Myself as chair, Councilor Melville, Councilor McGinn, Councilor Rosendahl, and Councilor Turco. We're all here. Awesome. If we could open it up, we have a presentation regarding the MVP Stakeholder Workshop Summary of Findings. And Mr. Mayor, are you you'd like to greet us and start, Mr. Mayor? Thank you.
Well, good evening, councilors. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to say a few words before we go to the presentation. Tonight's presentation really is just shows another example of a terrific partnership between state and local government. The MVP, or Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, helps cities and towns like Peabody develop resiliency plans for the effects of natural and extreme weather-related events. And certainly we all know they are happening much too frequently lately. The city received an MVP planning grant of $25,000 from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs last fiscal year. The grant helped fund the MVP workshop, which took place last April 11th, and included a very dedicated team of community stakeholders, including representatives from local environmental organizations, our Conservation Commission, our police, fire, emergency response teams, health and human services, public works. We actually had some Peabody High School students and teachers, environmental scientists, planners, engineers, a number of city councilors, and other local officials. It was an excellent workshop. The city contracted with the Horsley Witten Group to provide MVP certified staff to support the city in planning and facilitating the workshop. During the workshop, our Peabody team discussed a full range of vulnerability points throughout the city, which could be particularly vulnerable to the effects of hurricanes, winter storms, heavy rain events, flooding, drought, and other hazards. And I think certainly all of you know our weak points very well. This summer, Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito came to Peabody at the East End Veterans Memorial Park to award the city 2 MVP grants, and a number of you were there. I think actually all of you were there that day. It was a wonderful moment for the city in which we were provided 2 grants totaling almost $500,000. The first grant was the Lawrence Brook Watershed Flood Mitigation Grant, and the second was the Peabody North River Canal Resiliency Wall. Those were in the amount of $243,000, and the second one $224,000. And certainly Brendan will be able to break down that much more in detail with this presentation, along with words from Peter and Ellie. Tonight's hearing is the final step towards achieving our full MVP designation so that our city is better prepared for natural and extreme weather-related hazards, and we become eligible, very important, we become eligible for future funding opportunities. So I'm very pleased and very appreciative of all the work that has gone into to get us to this point. And I think Peabody is taking the right steps to make sure that as best we can protect ourselves, protect our residents from some of these extreme weather events. I'll certainly be here for the presentation and ready to answer any questions, but I believe Councilor McGinn will be moving forward with some comments. And again, I'll be here to answer any questions. But thank you for allowing me to open up with some comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilor McGinn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Mayor.
We'll suspend this until we can figure out what's going on. Thank you. All right, let's try this again. Councilor Manning Martin, welcome. We're talking about Municipality Vulnerability Program, and it's Councilor McGinn, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess that was somewhat serendipitous as we begin to speak about emergency preparedness that the fire alarm goes off. So yes, I was a participant in the April planning session with this MVP program, so I'm very happy to make some opening comments this evening. And the first comment is really a question, which is, do you recognize this body of water? And it is in Peabody. And off in the distance, on the left picture there's a hint. I think you can see the top of St. Vasilius. That's off in the distance, so that probably gives it away. This is Easton Memorial Veterans Park, which opened in the spring of 2013. And these pictures, however, were taken on August 12th, 2018, just 6 weeks ago. So the good news is this park was designed to flood and act as a retention area, and flood it did. And I'd also comment that the irony of it is just a few weeks earlier, we were standing on that stage, which is now underwater, receiving a couple of state grants to deal with climate change. So we were literally at ground zero for that, for the climate issue. Peabody has taken a number of steps to mitigate flooding, like the creation of this park over the years. However, it's imperative that we do more. As we know, our rivers ultimately lead to the ocean, so what happens to the ocean does, in fact, impact Peabody. This presentation is intended to be an overview and accordingly is not going to provide a great deal of data. However, much data is available, and the range of estimates on sea level rise in this area in this century range from 1.5 to 4 feet. Again, 1.5 to 4 feet. That is a staggering amount of additional water pushing back into Peabody. Sea level rise is but one threat to Peabody. Climate change has already resulted in more frequent and intense storms. At a recent meeting, Councilor Gravel wondered out loud, when did we start measuring rain in inches and feet? That's a great question. Because both the ocean and the atmosphere are warmer, storms can now hold more moisture. To illustrate that point, you only need to think back to Florence a few days ago, which dropped unprecedented amounts of rain in parts of the East Coast. Because Peabody has a well-known flooding vulnerability, it is imperative that we do more as conditions that contribute to flooding worsen. Peabody's flood mitigation efforts to date have been based on historic norms. We need to shift that thinking and plan for future norms. That shift in thinking is part of what this MVP program is about. These storms and changing conditions bring with them threats that go beyond flooding. In the next 30 years, in our lifetime, and if not, certainly in the lifetime of our children, Massachusetts will likely have a climate similar to the climate of the state of Maryland that they have today. As time moves on, Massachusetts' climate will be similar to North Carolina's current climate. The changes that will come with that shift need to be identified and addressed with good planning. That planning has begun with Peabody's participation in the MVP process. As a city, it is essential that we prepare in order to protect the health and safety of our citizens and the vitality of our local economy. In the U.S., Massachusetts is a leader on the climate issue, and Peabody should be a leader too. Peabody is well positioned to deal with this because we have been studying and acting on flooding for years. Consequently, we have experience on which to build. Thus, Peabody can be a leader and a model for other communities. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ellie Baker from Horsley Witten and to get into some additional details. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor. Welcome, Ms. Baker. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, councilors, for having me here today, and thank you for that introduction. I just want to give you a quick overview of these items, the little bit of background about the state's MVP program so you can understand sort of where this fits into what the state is doing. Explain a little bit about the workshop process that we went through. I'm just going to touch a little bit on climate change projections that we discussed, just so you're aware of what we talked about at the workshop. And then I will turn it over to Brendan Callahan to present the recommendations that came out of the workshop. I'm an environmental planner with the Horsley Witten Group, and we were contracted to work with the city and sort of walk through this process. So just to start back, September 2016, the governor issued an executive order that basically directed the state to assist communities to better prepare for weather-related impacts, climate change, and reduce vulnerabilities. So there were 3 items that he basically directed the state to undertake. So the first one is to develop a climate change clearinghouse, which is basically a big website database where you can go and find out lots of information about climate projections, things that have happened in the past, records of changes that we've already observed, et cetera. And a lot of this data has been downscaled to the Peabody region, to the Watershed, specific to Massachusetts. So it's a great resource to be aware of. He also directed the state to create the Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. You may be familiar with the climate adaptation plans that every community and the state has to prepare for FEMA. And Massachusetts was one of the first states, I think the first state, to integrate climate adaptation into that plan and recognize that, as Councilor McGinn said, there is sort of a new norm that we're working towards here. And the third item is this Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which the City of Peabody received a grant to participate in. So the first step in that is to receive technical assistance to go through this workshop process and become certified. So that's what we're completing today. And the second piece of that grant program is the release of implementation funds for implementing some of the recommendations that come out of these workshops. So I'll talk a little bit more about these items very quickly. Can you go to the next slide? So this is just the resilientma.org website. This is the climate clearinghouse website that you can go to. This will be maintained by the state continually. There's lots of information there. So I would encourage you to check that out if you're looking for any info. Next one. The state's Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan was actually just adopted last week. So this kind of outlines what the state is going to do over the next 5-10 years for climate adaptation. Next one. And then this map, I know it's hard to see specific towns, but there have been 2 rounds of grant applications. The towns in blue, light blue and dark blue, were participants in the first round of grants. Peabody was a recipient of the first round of grants. And then the next one. And then there was another round of grants in June, and there were grants that were issued for this planning process as well as implementation grants. So there was quite a bit of money that came out of this. There were $2 million for planning and $5 million that went to about, I think, 25 communities or so for implementation funds. So Peabody was able to partake in that as well because you had gone through this workshop process. Next one. And then just recently in August, the governor signed the Massachusetts climate change legislation, the environmental bond bill. And this kind of reiterates his take on the importance of this climate resilience work. And so there has been more money that's been designated for climate change preparedness through this MVP program, so this will carry on. Grants will continue to be available through this program now that you're certified. There will also be money put towards environmental protection and other community infrastructure investments related to climate resilience. Next one. So just to talk a little bit about what this workshop process was, we started working with the city in January, and I think on February 1st was our first meeting with this core planning group. I had 2 folks from my firm came, and we met with this group, Brendan, Chris, Chief Pasden, David Terranzoni, and Kurt Bellavance. We met twice. We planned what the workshop would be, what the content of the workshop would be, and also very specifically who should be participating in the workshop in terms of identifying key stakeholders in the group. So it was a very thoughtful process about reaching out to try and get key representatives from across the community. Next one. So the goal for the workshop was really, it was a full-day workshop, and it was a lot of interactive discussion, and ultimately the goal for the workshop was to, at the end of the day, come up with 5 or 6 highest priority actions for climate resilience. What should the city be doing right now, or get started on right now, to reduce your vulnerability to weather-related impacts? Next one. So the workshop format, just quickly, as I said, it was very interactive. I did a presentation at the beginning to kind of set the stage of the climate change hazards and impacts that we would be discussing. And then we really had breakout groups, and the first thing was to identify vulnerable features throughout the city, think about strengths that you already have to help you address some of these climate impacts, and then develop actions. So each breakout group developed their own list of actions that the city that they would recommend to the city, and then we had a group discussion to really talk about how those things matched up, prioritize them, and come up with a list of 5 or 6 final actions. Next one. I won't go through the details of this, but we did have sort of a handout and a little presentation on climate change projections. We talked about temperature, precipitation, sea level rise projections, other weather-related impacts from storms. And so we did, kind of give this a background. I'm not going to go through that now, but that's in the report if you're interested. Next one. And these were the hazards that we discussed, just to give the context for what we were talking about. We were looking at drought and fire issues, extreme heat and extreme cold, and how that impacts different populations and different facilities in the community, intense rain and flooding, which is probably something you're most commonly thinking about when you think of vulnerabilities, and then storms and sea level rise and how that impacts Peabody from downstream impacts. Next one. We also provided some maps, so I'm not going to walk through this map, but there were reference maps for everybody. People find maps to be a helpful reference, so we walked through some key relevant infrastructure and different locations throughout the community, and each table had maps that they could draw on and point to and use as reference points for their discussion. Next one. And in terms of what the actions were that people were discussing, it was a whole variety of different things that could be recommended here. So some of the actions might have been engineering or construction-related projects, could also be conservation, land conservation, preserving wetlands, those types of things. Also discussion of retreat or avoidance, so getting out of floodplains. Preparation and planning, so looking at more of emergency preparedness and emergency response planning recommendations. And then lastly, policy and regulatory changes. So some of these things ended up on the final list, some didn't, but these are the types of, the sort of menu of items that we were looking at. And also we were looking at things that, some items that we talked about were short-term, some were long-term, but in order to achieve them need to be started right away. So that was kind of the mindset, that the door was open for kind of anything that people thought was a real priority right now. Next one. So I'm going to turn it over to Brendan to talk about what the final outcomes were from the workshop, but we brought all the work groups together to really come up with a prioritization here. I think Brendan's going to present the 7 recommendations. These were the top recommendations, but I wouldn't say necessarily they are in any particular order. These were just the ones that rose to the top. So I'll turn it over to Brendan Callahan.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Mr. Callahan, thank you.
Thank you, Brendan Callahan, Assistant Director of Planning. As Ellie mentioned, we had a large group at this workshop meeting, and we broke the groups into the large group into smaller groups, and they would sit down and we discussed the 3 small groups, came up with 5 to 6 priorities for the workshop, and then from there we each small group had somebody present the priorities. And then we narrowed it down to a large group, 7 priorities. The first priority was to evaluate and assess alternatives for managing commonly flooded areas and flood-impacted public safety concerns located throughout the city, including along the North River Canal, the Lawrence Brook Watershed in downtown and along various brooks and channels. The group had identified that the city needs to continue the city's efforts to explore mitigating flood impacts throughout the city, not just in the downtown, but citywide, watershed-wide. Continue on the maintenance efforts of the waterways, removing trash and debris to maintain flow and alleviate any sort of localized floodings that can be from debris blocking the flow of the waterways. As well as continue to explore upstream storage options throughout the watershed, Lawrence Brook watershed, Some of the upstream storage projects that we've done in the past are working in the city. We have seen a reduction of the flooding in the downtown, and we will continue to explore those options. Improve emergency preparedness by evaluating alternative shelter locations for sustainable systems, planning for shelter upgrades, increasing education outreach efforts, increasing emergency response certification levels, and planning for emergency management staffing and CERT team. Issues were identified during the group discussion where currently the fire department and police department are located in flood zones, and we need to explore options of protecting those buildings or possibly relocating. As well as evaluate some of the emergency shelters. Are they appropriate locations? Are they in hazard areas? And as well as making sure that the shelters currently have adequate power, emergency power in an emergency event. And then also identify the departments who will maintain these shelters, making sure that they are adequate and ready for any sort of emergency response. Another recommendation was improve wetlands protection by revising the wetland protection ordinance to include limits on the allowable area of disturbance within the wetland and wetland buffers, and change the Conservation Commission's default of allowable disturbance to no disturbance. Currently, the ordinance is probably not enforced to the greatest extent. There are developments that are within the buffer zone and near resource areas, and we think the commission may want to look at enforcing this ordinance to a greater extent and limiting development in these in the no disturb zone. Another recommendation is evaluate and revise the city's land development and stormwater regulations to reduce impervious cover, reduce flooding, and improve stormwater detention, infiltration, and treatment in the city. And review parking requirements, road design requirements, utility requirements, and impervious cover limits. More specifically, work to reduce flooding in the North River watershed by enhancing stormwater regulation and management. Flood mitigation studies throughout the years have recommended reducing the impervious cover citywide, and possibly limiting the parking requirements so you don't need to create such large areas of impervious surface. Also, one item that was discussed is exploring a stormwater utility. This could be used to help maintain the city's drainage infrastructure and stormwater management. Another priority was flood-proof and upgrade sewer pump stations, including the station on Russell Street and other vulnerable to flooding. This was another one where some of the pump stations are located in flood zones, and we need to evaluate if we need to relocate these pump stations or elevate them so they are above the flood level, flood elevation. I think we're getting a little too fast there. Do we lose one? Oh, sorry. Another was to conduct a public buildings assessment to evaluate their capacity for withstanding hazard events. This is consistent with the priority 2 and number 5 I mentioned earlier, and they just want to make sure that the buildings have enough proper power during an emergency, as well as to assess the different public buildings that are, to get us a sense of how many are in a hazard area or flood zone in the city. And finally, identify, evaluate, and secure alternate sources of water to mitigate water supply impacts during drought conditions. It was identified to protect water resource areas and preserve natural buffers near these resources, limit development near the water resources, and also make sure sufficient water source or a backup plan is in place during drought conditions. These were the 4 top priority recommendations that we came up with in the workshop group. As we have mentioned earlier, the state announced a MVP action grant shortly after we conducted the workshop, and did apply for 2 action grants, and were able to, we were awarded those for the North River project, as well as the Lawrence Brook Watershed project. At this time, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer those for you.
Thank you, Mr. Callahan. Any questions for Ms. Baker or Mr. Callahan in regards to the program? Councilor Manning Martin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, did you say that you applied, but you haven't heard yet on the 2 grants?
No, we did apply and were awarded. It was one of the fastest, quickest turnaround of grants I've ever seen. We applied in May of 2018, and they made a grant award announcement within 2 weeks of them being due. And I don't know if you were present, but as some of the councilors are here, Lieutenant Governor Polito came to the city of Peabody and gave a presentation for all the state's awardees, and I believe Peabody was received the largest amount of money.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Melville, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I did have a question. I don't know who to direct this to, but I remember when the retention basins were being put in around the Welch School, and those have been really impactful, especially with like the Stormwater Brook flow with the last few storms. I abut the property, so I abut the brook, so I could watch the water level, especially with the amount of rain we got. I expected it to overtop itself. It did not, and I think it was because of the catch basins delaying and going towards like the North River and the rest of it. But my question is, with those retention basins, what are we, and this could be a city, are we going to use, how are we going to maintain those? One fear I have, and you can start to see it now, is that the growth is coming in, and just naturally over time it fills itself, whether the dead growth leaves itself behind over the winter, and that becomes soil, and it fills. And my concern only is on, and I don't know if we can look at a long-term part of the project as much as building these to facilitate what we're seeing as possible climate change in the area, but is how do we maintain what we're putting in place? I certainly, East End Veterans Park, when I saw the pictures, I mean that's a large amount of water in the middle of a neighborhood. Essentially created a pond. So that's my question.
I think I can answer this. So those type of stormwater management controls that we did, the natural water quality basins, natural water drainage swales. There are no. It's not like a new technique, but they are becoming more common throughout the common in Massachusetts and the communities, and other communities have this issue where we're building these new stormwater BMPs, but the DPW departments haven't really been trained properly how to maintain those, and I think that could be something that through this grant program and an action grant where we could possibly apply for funding to get the training for the DPW, DPS staff to properly maintain these BMPs. So they're working, they're effective, but you are absolutely correct. We do need to maintain them to probably a higher level than cleaning out catch basins.
Yeah, and just from my experience, from what I've seen, they do work. They actually are pretty. The landscaping is nice with them. They do add to the neighborhood and things like that. I guess that they're not just simply holes, because you don't want to turn them into swamps. They got to drain, so it's not just that simple. And what my concern is that drainage area, if it gets with the growth, I don't want it to turn into a retention pond. I guess it turns into then there would be an issue because of all the things that go with that. But I commend you for this, and I absolutely, as a neighborhood that's impacted by this where I live, and there has been positive steps taken, and people have noticed. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Melville. Councilor Turco, then Councilor McGinn, please. No, Councilor McGinn before that.
Thank you, Mr.
Comment
Chairman.
back?
Just to comment back through you, Mr. Chair, to Councilor Melville on the maintenance issue, because I think Mr. Callahan's comment dealt primarily with maintenance for those features where they exist on public property, but some of those features exist on private property as well. So this doesn't all come down on the city. Some of it comes down on private property owners as well. And I think a good lesson in that was how Councilor Turco handled the development recently up on Farm Ave, where he made certain that that was part of the conditions on the permit, that they had a maintenance program in place for the stormwater retention features on their private property. So it's as we say at work, it's an all play for this to work. It's not going to fall exclusively on in the public domain to tackle this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor. Councilor Turco, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Brendan Callahan. So on the August 12th rainfall, we saw different, I believe it was August 12th, the 8 inches of rain we got, we saw different areas that had been subjected to flooding in the past, but it was more severe this time, generally in the South Peabody areas, Wards 1 and 2. Does this program address, is it current to the fact that, you took into account the August 12th rainfall and maybe saw some new areas? And I know Councilor Gould and I, we went to it, Quail Road, Robin Road, Granite Road, and Browns Pond, and we saw different areas along with the mayor. And I know the mayor and his staff are working diligently on some corrections to those areas, but does this program address that, those areas? Because I believe a lot of that's Goldwaith Brook.
There was no specific areas that were identified as part of the workshop. It was more just a watershed-wide, identifying throughout the watershed the need to address localized flooding, but no specific locations. I guess other than the North River and the Lawrence Brook were actually identified, but we also included just the waterways throughout the North River watershed.
Okay, so I guess my question is, in the long term, will some of those smaller tributaries be addressed? Because I did see you had Stormwater Brook and Goldwaith Brook in there. I just didn't know, whereas the water's definitely coming from upstream, South Peabody and then down into downtown Peabody. We know that. In order to prevent Ward 1 and 2 from flooding, which we've done a good job at, what's the long-term goal with some of those tributaries?
The long-term goal is to mitigate flooding throughout the entire city. The way that these priority recommendations were written would allow us to go after funding resources that we could then identify those localized areas and come up with potential mitigation measures. So that's why the recommendations are watershed-wide and not very specific. But it still allows us to go into those localized areas.
Thank you.
Councilor Turco, did not go unnoticed that you used the word tributaries twice. Good job. Tributaries. Nice job. I'm going to ask, where is Lawrence Brook watershed?
It's mostly underground. It does start up by, I believe it's the Connolly School. Is that in Easton, Peabody, I guess? Connolly Playground. It does start slightly upland of Conley Playground, and then it's basically a culvert. It's buried basically in a pipe. There are some small sections that are daylighted behind Bob Danisco's redevelopment site on Tremont Street. It is daylighted there, and I believe there is another section further up in the watershed that's daylighted, but I think about 90% of it is piped.
Any other questions? Any comments? I just want to commend the mayor and his team, Mr. Callahan, and thank you, Ellie, for helping us. Anything we can do to be proactive, living where we live and with the changing world that we live in. Mr. Mayor, any final comments?
No, I just wanted to jump in and piggyback on your comments. And I really wanted to thank Brendan for his hard work on this. He's really been carrying this along with Kurt, our Community Development Office, and Horsley Witten has done a terrific job. And, so many of you have been involved in this. This is going to be something that we'll be working on for many years to come, and then the next group of mayors and city councilors will be doing the same. This will be a continuing battle for the foreseeable future, but I think we can continue to make improvements. These grants This work is going to, again, allow us to take some small step improvements just in our whole overall ability to handle water, the ability to hold more water and allow it to be released in a way that we want it to be released. And but there's still a great deal of work. And it was strange, as Councilor Turco mentioned, there were some during this, and we've had some incredible amount of rain recently, even the last couple nights. And some of the areas that we were concerned about, we did very, very well. And then there were some new areas that are having a little bit more difficulty. So I think this is just going to be continuing work on our end to identify ways to help some of the different neighborhoods. And but this is another big step for us. And I feel like because of Brendan's efforts, because of Kurt's efforts, and others in city government, we're very far ahead as opposed to other cities and towns with our preparedness. And I want to thank the governor, lieutenant governor. They've believed in Peabody, and they've really stepped up for us with these grants. We, as Brendan mentioned, we received the highest amount of grants for this this phase 2, or this second part. And that's why the lieutenant governor came to Peabody that day, because we were the city that was receiving the most money. And I think a lot of that is to do with their interest in our community, but also the work that we've done to prepare, and we've followed every step that we're supposed to, and we've put ourselves in a great position to get this additional money. And we also had a terrific turnout at the conference in April. All of our city departments, residents, planning board members, it was really a great group. Everybody dedicated some time to come and give their feedback, as well as I know a number of city councilors attended too. So this has been a total team effort.
Mr. Mayor, if there's no further comments, thank you, Ms. Baker. Appreciate you coming. Mr. Callahan. Take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. Motion to adjourn.